Hillary, it's so great to see you. It's been months since we've last kind of been in the same room together, and although we're 6 feet apart, it's like nice to actually see you face to face. We are here today to talk a little bit about kind of how to visit colleges when you can't actually visit them in person, and I think it's a really great topic given the time we are kind of in this unprecedented area. And we as folks, I think, really love to see students, but we know that a lot of students can't visit campus for a number of reasons, and so we just wanted to kind of touch on ways that students can get to know more colleges in general. But why don't we start by having you give a little bit of background about kind of what you do here in the office and who you are, and all that great stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I am an assistant director of admission on our Siegel Visitor Center staff, where we're sitting right now. I work a lot with a lot of our current students on our tour guide program, which I direct. And in the last few months of, as you said, kind of unprecedented non-face-to-face interactions, I've been helping to kind of spearhead a lot of the ways we're helping students access the university and learn about it online and digitally. And it's been kind of a brave new world of figuring that out. And it's been a lot of fun and cool to be able to bring Northwestern to people's homes in a way we've never really done before.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the kind of starting point for a lot of our conversations, right? Is we're sort of trying to understand how students are grappling with the situation. They're at home all the time, and they still sort of want to get to know colleges, but we know that it can be challenging for a lot of folks. And so I think part of the thing that we always think about is we love Northwestern, we work here, but we wanted to kind of broaden that out a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of how do you get to know colleges in general. And I think for us, when we're thinking about students, it's a wide range of folks, right? There are folks who have known they wanted to go to a school since the time they were small. There are folks who are just like, there's so much out there, I don't know what to do. And I think it's, sometimes overwhelming for a lot of students because there's so much information out there about colleges. And so when we're sort of thinking about starting the college search, are there any tips that you have or things that you think about or common practices that you come across with folks who are kind of starting to form their college lists or thinking about, I'm looking at sort of diving in, but I don't know how to get started. What is your advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, overwhelming is, I think, the best word to describe it, especially because it's not just information from the colleges, right? It's information from third parties. It's the media. It's friends and family who turn into experts on colleges once you turn 16. And I think that one of the big pieces I always give to especially younger students is that college is a lot of different things. It's a lot of different things to different people, right? So yes, it's getting a degree, it's going to class, it's finding a major, but it's also finding a community. It's also finding a home for the next 4 years. And in many cases, the first time you really have control over where you're living and all these different things. And I think that part of what's so overwhelming about the search is that any student who starts this will see that there are a lot of things in common between different schools, right? The sizes might be similar. The specific classes within a major might be similar. So I think understanding the pieces of the college experience that you're looking for outside of the standard, right? Outside of the classes you're taking, outside of your major, is really important, and understanding the impact that something like weather might have on you. We have this beautiful day in Evanston right now. We sometimes have colder weather. So for a student who is really intent on a specific type of kind of outdoor experience, for instance, that could be a really important factor, whereas for their best friend, that might not matter as much. So I think that understanding what it is that a student wants out of the college experience is a really important place to start, because then they can start kind of picking out of those overwhelming sets of information where the fit is and where the positive aspects of individual schools might be that might not stand out to another person. And it can, I think, be helpful in starting to kind of parse out some of that information.
Well, and I think that what you said about kind of those different axes, those different sort of ideas about classroom and also, thinking about community are really important to parse out, right? Because I think a lot of times students sort of just jump in and say one school has to have everything, right? And they start with a name or they start with a reputation, and they sort of kind of start their process that way. And I say, like, I think in many ways, some of those things might be different, right? The kinds of things that you're looking for in terms of a classroom environment might be at some schools, might not be others, whereas the overlap with the type of, community that you want, with the location that you want. And so all of these sort of things are levers that you kind of have to figure out. And I think it's tough for students to kind of start that process because they just want an answer, I think, a lot of times to it. But I think there's also a joy or an opportunity in that when you sort of, think about what are the kinds of things that are a great fit for me. There's so many schools in the U.S. and we're so fortunate to have a number of institutions at all these different levels, right? And I think that's part of the challenge too, is to get students to think about what are the differences between like a small liberal arts college versus a state school versus a flagship school from a state system versus a private school, and how do all those things offer or align with what my priorities are. That can be a daunting process, I think, for a lot of students. But I think, if you do some good work early on and figure out what your priorities are, it's really helpful at the back end, especially in your junior and senior year to me, because you can sort of say like, okay, I know why I'm going to this school, or I know why, a small liberal arts college might not be the best fit for me. And I always used to laugh when I talk to students because they're like, oh, I have to go to a certain school. And I'm like,
right.
But why? Like,
right.
If you can make an argument to me about why this other type of school is not good for you, sure, I'll buy it. But a lot of times they were just like, oh, I'm enamored with this school. And I was like, that's
Absolutely.
not the same thing, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think part of what we're thinking about when we're like, how do you visit colleges or do research, is really helping students parse out some of those things. And so I think one of the things that I always encourage students to do is, even if you feel like you're never going to go to a state school,
right.
at least sort of like take a visit online, do a virtual tour, and sort of say, let me have that as a marker of what that type of institution might be, at least so I can kind of have an awareness and then kind of, put these things into broad categories or have a reference point, I guess.
Yeah.
But when you're thinking about sort of like students who are actually going out to, start the process, they've done their research, they sort of have a sense of like, okay, I want to learn more about what it means to go to a research university.
Right.
Are there particular ways that you would suggest that students get started, or practices that you found that have been really successful for students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you also bring up the really important point that it's okay to not have it all figured out, right? It's okay when you're going through this process, as you're learning all these things and as you're, as you said, exploring different types of universities. I think it's okay to come to the conclusion that you're okay with different types of schools. And there's this kind of dream school myth, I think, that every single 17-year-old has this one perfect fit institution. But we all know from our own experiences from working in this field, that's just not true, right? The idea of a college list is that every school on that list should be a place where you can see yourself thriving and being happy. But kind of to your specific question, I think that one of the most important things is that student perspective. And I can't stress that enough. And I think that anytime you as a prospective student, as a high school student, are able to understand the student experience, whether that's through any way you can connect one-on-one with students, but even through the social media piece. I know that something I always tell students to do is go to that location tag on Instagram and see what pictures have been posted with that location. Like that's that really organic, raw kind of student experience. See what you can find that students themselves are saying about their institutions, because I think that the words they use and the energy they bring, it helps you kind of parse out what that experience actually is. And you might find two schools that on paper look pretty similar, and you might find that the energy coming from the students, while maybe in both places is great, it's just different. And you might be able to start seeing those kind of less tangible differences. I think it's hard to put the feeling of a community into words, and that's something that all of us try to do when we, as admissions representatives or as alumni, when we're talking about our alma maters, we try really hard to articulate it. But I think that there's something to be said for finding the student perspective that's not inherently attempting to articulate the community, but represents the community all the same. And especially now in this time when students haven't been on campus for a while, I think that also, I think that seeing the ways that students have remained engaged with their communities and remained engaged with their friends who they normally would live next door to, and right now they're 3,000 miles from, I think that there is something to be said for that, and seeing where those communities are able to kind of transcend the physical campus. And I think that especially in the last few months, we've seen great examples of that kind of across the board at different schools.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point too, right? When you think about how communities kind of are grappling with this time, when a lot of them are scattered to all different parts of the country, a lot of students, are trying to maintain their bonds and to sort of get a sense of that rhythm is potentially tougher, right, as an outside student. But I think if you can get a sense of kind of how that community interacts or even responds to something like this, I think that can be very informative for you about, whether that's a fit for you as a type of community that you would want to engage with. But I think the point about kind of social media is a really interesting one because when I taught undergraduates, I sort of often talk to them very carefully about like, how do you evaluate your source, right? And I think there's something really great to this idea of getting the unfiltered version of this just smattering of student life and getting a broad perspective. But at the same time, I always try to ask students to be critical about like, okay, who's talking about this? And not to say that their responses or their opinions are invalid, right? But you sort of take it with this perspective of there are students who are talking about things, especially on, and I laugh, but we have sites like College Confidential. There's places where students will kind of tell stories about things and share information. And I think there's a potentially useful kind of mode to that, but it's also a case where you want to sort of say, like with any kind of review site, who is sort of this person, what is their history of reviews, and sort of just for you understanding that context, I think is important as opposed to just taking it as given fact, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in an age of social media, it's even trickier potentially because you have so many more voices, and it's like, how do you sort through all of them? And I think one of the things that I really love is that there are a lot of schools that are out there that are sort of having social media teams, or they're having sort of paraprofessional folks who are in an office and sort of our current undergraduate students. And so there is some, kind of way where there's some oversight to that, but they're also helping students, prospective students, get some insight into the ways that schools are working. But sort of when you think about kind of interfacing with the student body, would you say like you've had success with folks kind of setting up one-on-one meetings with current students, or having channels where they're able to interact with, club presidents or things like that as a way to kind of learn a little bit more about the school?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's something that 6 months ago, I might have had a different answer, but if you go to almost any admissions office website right now, at different types of institutions, different sizes, et cetera, you'll find student perspectives. And in some cases, again, 6 months ago, that might have just been a student blog, or it might have just been the kind of curated admissions office Instagram, right? But now, more often than not, you do find those opportunities where you can sign up to have a one-on-one conversation with a student. You can watch a student panel online. You can watch a virtual club fair. We've seen all different kinds of really cool things coming out of different institutions. And you are in this position right now, especially where, because no one is coming to campuses, because there isn't any focus on any sort of campus programming, everything is focused online, and everything is focused on bringing this experience kind of to your living room. And I think that universities know that their greatest asset is their current student body, right? I think we all know that we're great, but the students are greater. And they have that perspective, and they have that voice, and that they're really in tune with what's happening on campus or virtually on a campus online. And I do think that more often than not, if you just dig into those admissions office websites, you do find those opportunities. And I feel like every week more and more of them are cropping up across different universities and colleges. And I think that is such an important and valuable opportunity. And I think it does say something about the student body, right? To have current students who aren't even on campus right now, who are taking the time and are excited about having those conversations with prospective students and sharing what they love about their institutions, while maybe also being honest about kind of ways in which they've seen their institutions improve. I think that that says a lot about what that campus culture is. And I think that's, again, kind of getting back to those intangibles. It says something about what it's like to go there, that you are dedicated to your institution to the point that you don't have to be on campus to want to be engaged with it, or engaged with potential kind of future classmates. And I do think that a lot of universities are finding ways to do that.
Well, and I think the thing that's exciting about that is I've seen a lot of schools that have been better about amplifying voices of groups where, I think this current crop of seniors and juniors, anecdotally, so take it with that.
Right.
But I think we've heard that they've been a lot more kind of attuned to things in terms of kind of finding their spaces, finding their people. Certainly a lot of things in the ether right now in terms of social justice movements. Folks are very interested in kind of knowing, how is the school going to support me in that? And
Right.
I think that this opportunity for them to connect with resource centers or places on campus and say like, okay, what is my experience going to be like when I'm there potentially, right, is super helpful. Because I think in many ways we put out statistics, we talk a lot as admission professionals about kind of things that we think we're doing well, but I think there's also a way in which students want to kind of color that in and say like, okay, what does it actually mean for me to be on campus living in this environment? Is there a support system?
Right.
And I think now is the time to sort of like reach out, because if we're not able to communicate with you about those things, as a prospective student, it's probably not going to get better.
Right. What happens when you get here? Right. Totally.
So I think that's a great thing where students often sort of talk about the flashy side where they're like, oh, let me look at all, like the concerts that students are going to or the football games.
The brand new dorms.
Yeah, which is great.
Totally. Totally.
There's certainly something to that, but I also sort of, try to push students to say like, okay, what are the things that are important to you, right? If like your community, and define that how you will, like reach out to them and see what that's all about as well. And I guess that's an interesting thing that you mentioned too. You kind of talked about sort of the balance between social media and student voices, and then also kind of the admission folks. Like, what do you see our role as kind of the official voice and all that sort of stuff in this process? Like, how do students balance that information, which can and I'm going to cop to it, can sometimes be a little bit drier. It's a little bit more informational, but I think that there's still a place for it, right? But how do students sort of like navigate that? And not go too far to one side of just social media or just admission information that's official?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's hard too, because I do think that, again, getting back to this idea that this college search is going to look different for every individual, I think the balance will be different for every individual, right? I kind of think of when I talk to students or when I give an information session or whatever it might be, I think of myself as like the preview you see a year before the movie comes out, right? I'm hopefully drawing you in enough that you want to learn more and that you're excited to see that full movie. But I'm not there to paint your 4 years for you. And I think that especially right now with so much focus on digital programming and online opportunities, I think that we as admissions officers are here to be kind of the guides that bring you to the other sources of information, right? So I have actually never worked for an institution that I attended. So I've never had the alumni perspective, and I always am very honest about that. But I also think that even if I did, it would have been a while ago. And my experiences as a student might be very different from the experiences that students have now, depending on the campus culture and depending on what's going on in the world, right? And so I do think that our role, and hopefully the role of admissions officers really across the board, is to say, okay, you think that X, Y, and Z are the important parts of your college experience and what you're looking for. Here are the places you can get that firsthand information. I'm also happy to kind of parse out that information for you and share it with you, but I'm a secondhand source. And I do think that there's something to be said for the maybe not just social media, but websites and content that's out there that's not tailored to admissions, right? When a student group maybe posts a performance online, that's very different from us having the leader of that student group come and talk about their student group to prospective students. And so I think that we cater to a very specific audience, but it's also our responsibility to bring that audience into conversations and into information that maybe isn't specifically tailored to them, and therefore helps them get that kind of full picture of the institution and of the experience. And I do think that, especially right now, there's just so much out there that we can kind of guide them to. And I think that's kind of the role we play right now. I don't know if that's how you feel as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting take on it, right? This idea where we are kind of helping students to learn more about what they're interested in. And we are not necessarily kind of from on high, kind of giving these mandates about how things are, but instead sort of seeing our role as facilitators in many ways of kind of taking students' interest and saying, here's how you can sort of deepen that, or, on the flip side, exposing them to areas that they might not have thought about and say, like, challenging them a little bit and say, okay, you're interested in X, Y, and Z, but like, what about this other thing over here? And I think that's the sort of hope that we have with a lot of our students, is that they're in this very exploratory process, right? They're seeking to learn more and not necessarily just trying to get answers to questions in terms of, how am I going to go to grad school? How am I going to get a job as a doctor and things? And I think there's a place for that where we can certainly, talk about support services. But I think the thing that's really exciting about college is to say, like, how can I be a doctor but also study art history, right? Or something else.
Absolutely.
And have this really great experience. And I think, your point of sort of us being a resource for folks is very well taken, where I think, especially in this current day and age where a lot of things are in flux, and certainly, even our campus is changing every day, every week. I think the role that we play in many ways is sort of to be that kind of foundational kind of voice, right? Where we're saying, okay, here's some kind of the things that we know, here's the information that we have, and sort of provide some of that guidance and kind of steady the boat a little bit for students, but at the same time encourage them to, not limit themselves to just our voices, right?
Right. I mean, it's like working at a grocery store, right? People go in, they browse, they go aisle to aisle. If they, after looking, can't find something, you find an employee and ask them where it is. And that's in some ways kind of the role that we can play, right? Especially if a student is kind of doing this kind of self-directed search and is clicking on the links on the websites and looking at the content and doing what they can when they can't find something easily, or if there's a question or a concern they have that's not so cut and dry, right? It's not a yes, no, do you have this program or do you have this support? That's where we can really jump in and act as that kind of expert guide, I think.
Well, and I think that, like, to encourage that, I would say, like, this is our job in many ways, right? And we know that students who are searching have questions about things. And so I would always encourage students to kind of contact the official source.
Right. Yes.
If you, even if you're just like following up and you're like, oh, I heard this on a review site, or, I saw this on social media, but like, can you give me another take on it, right?
Check your sources.
Yeah,
totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's like, sort of like just combining these data points and getting information and saying like, okay, well, maybe the official, response from a school is kind of taking this line. Maybe a school has a student has a different take on it.
Right.
And so triangulating and getting a broader picture, right? But not just sort of like letting it lie with one voice. And I think that's really helpful because a lot of times I think we as admission folks, we are the folks who we're just like, why are people asking each other like to grade themselves on essays? And what is the chance that you're going to get in? You're like, how does anyone else know?
Right.
And not that we can tell you necessarily over the phone exactly what your chances are either, but we're like, if I can't do it, like, how is someone else going to do it? And so I think there's a way in which you really want to kind of, I think exactly as you said, evaluate your sources, right? And be mindful of where the information is coming from. But with that too, I think there's this sort of idea where, we have a lot of kind of official sources from folks, and knowing that students typically kind of take a tour of campus and are physically here, like, what are some of the ways that folks can get a sense of that? Because I think a lot of times students will look to the admission office or a visitor center to kind of get a sense of what the campus is all about. And that's obviously much more tricky right now. And so there's things like virtual tours or VR. There's like kind of a whole wild west of things. Like, are there particularly successful implementations that you've seen or kind of ways that you've noticed that schools are able to communicate who they are to students across the computer screen?
Yeah, that's, and I think that one of the silver linings of the fact that we've had to close campuses to visitors and the fact that we haven't been able to just continue with the status quo of how we share our institutions with prospective students has been that it really has forced the hand of institutions to cater to everyone, regardless of whether they can eventually come to visit campus or not. We've been in this situation where we do have to think of creative ways to, as you said, try to recreate that on-campus experience without anybody flying to campus. And I think that one of my favorite things I've seen are the kind of student-led initiatives online. And there are tons of institutions that are really letting their students do the talking. And because like you said, the information that we might share, while some of it might be very exciting, some of it isn't, right? And so having that student perspective there, and tons of institutions have been posting opportunities for students to engage with those prospective students and those high schoolers. I've also seen schools that, when it's feasible, have been filming things on campus, and whether that means having a single student tour guide wearing a mask and far away from whoever's filming walk around, or it's kind of little highlights of different parts of campus. There's something to be said for that, as opposed to, I'm sure that students are finding that those virtual tours can sometimes run together. And it's true. And in kind of, I think, non-COVID times and before we were all forced to pivot fully to online programming, I don't think that was as big of a problem, because it was one way of many for many students to kind of explore. Now that it is kind of the primary form, I do think you're seeing schools that are really trying to think outside of the box in terms of how to bring that on-campus experience to your computer screen. And then I also think that the schools that are maybe in this situation where they know they're not going to have anybody on campus anytime soon. And it, of course, depends on where you are. And like you said, things are changing every day on our campus. And I'm sure that that's how it is everywhere. I think that as this has become a longer term campus closure situation, it's not just a matter of schools moving their in-person programming online. I think you're finding schools that are tailoring their programming to a virtual world, which is very different, right? I mean, we can sit for 45 minutes with a camera in front of us and do our full information session that we would normally do in person, but it's just not the same. And I think that schools really across the board, I'm finding when we're doing kind of this evaluation of what everybody else is up to, I think that you're seeing in the last couple of months, especially, that schools are in this place of understanding that this is going to be our landscape, and that even when we can resume campus visits, we do want to make sure that somebody who can't visit campus for whatever reason is able to get the same type of information. And so I do think that especially this summer, as schools are able to kind of look to the future and look to this next class of students, that schools are being pretty innovative in terms of how they're finding that those opportunities to bring people to campus virtually. And I think that students are in a kind of a position of power here, right? If I know that in our office, if we get tons and tons and tons of feedback asking for a specific type of programming, or saying, we love what you've done, but XYZ is missing and we really want to hear this, and we see that consistently, we'll respond to it. So I think that prospective students are also in this kind of great power position right now, where if there's a clear hole in what a campus is offering, let them know what you're interested in seeing. Let them know what else they can offer you, because this is new for many of us and we want to give you what you want. And I think that that's a really important tool now too.
Well, and I think to add to that, I would say, I would encourage students to definitely kind of speak up and give their voice, because I think, especially as you said, at this current stage, a lot of us are figuring it out, right? We, to different degrees, have delved into online things before, but I think we're just in this new era where we are trying out new programming, we are doing new things, and so we don't know what works. And so it's really helpful to, I think, and I guess I should speak for myself. I don't know for every other school, but to get feedback and sort of understand, okay, this is what students are really looking for, right? Maybe like they are really looking for a deep dive into what it means to be a bio major at your school.
Right.
Who knows?
Right.
And I think we can tailor our programming, hopefully, to adapt around that. But I think the other thing that I would encourage students to do if they have a chance to give feedback is also help us understand why that's meaningful for them, right?
Totally.
Because I think a lot of times, we can produce content, ad nauseum, but I think if we can get a sense of like, okay, a student is really trying to understand the academic culture of a school, that's a slightly different question than, tell me more about your major,
Absolutely.
right? And so I would say, like, I would love that kind of information, because I think, it shows that a student's really thinking about how to engage with your school. To go back to this idea of community and sort of what we talked about at the onset, that's the sort of piece where I'm like, okay, there's ways that I can help you figure that out, that might not just be about an academic thing. Maybe let's talk about academic advising, or groups on campus that support academic interests.
And we can use our expertise, to your point, to kind of guide someone through that search process if we understand why they want something.
And so I think that's the thing where I always sort of laugh, where students are like, I want this, and I'm like, okay, that's great, but why? Why is the thing? But sort of thinking about, things like those slice of life kind of vignettes. I know that we've done some stuff with helping folks understand the food culture of campus. I really sort of love that we're taking risks in that way. I think that students hopefully respond to that. And I would say, the other thing that I would kind of put out there is like, if you see something that's like really great, where you're like, this was actually really helpful, let us know, because I think a lot of times we are just trying things and we think, in our head, and we talk to our students, we're like, oh, this would be cool, this would be helpful. But we don't know. And I think a lot of times we get some of the, the critiques or the things of like, you could do this better, but less of that actually worked really well. And so both of those kind of ends of the feedback spectrum, I think, are really helpful for us.
Yeah. And, I think that it's probably really easy if you're going to a bunch of online events for schools. And the same is true if you were able to do campus visits in a time when campus visits were still a thing. But you get those thank you emails asking you to fill out a survey. And I think there's this assumption that it's just a kind of lip service that we want your feedback. But I read through every single survey response we get. And I know that I can't speak for other institutions, but when we do get that kind of feedback in surveys and in the question when we ask what else we could be doing, we're really paying attention to that. And like you said, having the context for why something that we're not doing would be good for us to do is so helpful in us figuring out how to do it, right? We have to put together the what, the when, the why, the how, all of it. And so having that guidance to make sure that what we're producing and what we're doing is actually going to be helpful for the students who asked for it is huge. And I do think that just like with any sort of like review, right, people often only fill out a Yelp review, for instance, if they had really strongly positive feelings about that restaurant or super negative feelings. And it's so easy to only get the extremes, but it's also honestly helpful to hear from someone that this was great, this was helpful, and it doesn't need to be like praise, and it doesn't need to be superlatives, but just knowing that we're on the right track, even in a non-exciting way, is really helpful to know. So the moral of the story is fill out those surveys because we read them.
Well, I think on that note too, like thinking about sort of like the range of different kinds of things students get involved in, and knowing that students are busy, they have school, they're trying to sort of manage their lives at the same time. If there are just like a handful of things that they could do, like they don't have 50 hours to spend researching colleges. Right. Are there particular things that you think are kind of biggest bang for your buck in terms of helping students to get a quick snapshot of a school or learn more? And I would say, not just digital, but also, throw in print or other things as well.
Yeah.
How would you sort of start if you only had a few hours?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that the nice thing about website information and non-event sort of information is that you can consume it at your own pace and when you want. So even if that means that you're scrolling through on your phone while you're during a commercial, while you're watching TV or something, that's one nice thing, is that you can take in that sort of information at your own pace. And I do think that when I think about, like, when we, for instance, offer online information sessions, we have kind of grappled with the degree to which we might want to change the content, knowing that it's happening online and it's happening in a place where a lot of the content is available right at the top of the same page, right? Whereas when somebody's here in person and they're sitting in our auditorium and they have a member of our staff in front of them, it's a little bit different. I think that in terms of kind of most bang for your buck, I think that if you're going to attend one sort of online event or you're going to engage in one sort of kind of official programming piece, again, leaning toward anything that you know is going to involve current students, because you can get the information about the majors that are offered, and you can get the information, like the statistical information and the admissions process information from the websites. And kind of to your point, it's our job as admissions staff to always be available to answer those questions. So we work full time. We don't take summers off. Like, we're always here. So I think that taking advantage of those opportunities to engage with the people who you might not have easy access to. So again, those students, if I know that some universities are offering like mock online classes, like that's a great opportunity to engage with a faculty member who you don't have tons of access to in a normal time. So as much as I think that the content that we as admissions staff are putting out is helpful, I do think that if somebody is choosing between maybe going to an online student panel, or you mentioned like the food reviews that we did, those pieces of information and those interactions that are maybe a little bit harder to come across just at your own leisure, I think is definitely the most useful thing to do. And it'll vary from school to school. Different schools are doing different things. But like I said, at least in the research I've done, the vast majority of institutions of all kind of shapes and sizes are offering those unique opportunities online right now that they might not during a kind of business as usual year. And it's those opportunities that I think are going to give you the most that you can't get at your leisure at another time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a very good point about sort of getting the insider information, right? The things that are more difficult to access, because I think in some ways, we put out an information session every, so often. They're always available. They're like our most common thing.
Right.
And so I think there's some great value to listening to. I mean, we give them, so like they must be important, right? But I think, that idea where it's like, where can you drill down into the areas where you might not hear that voice, and making time to sort of, with a lot of the live chat features or interaction with the, even I think to the extent that you're able to interact with the other folks in the audience, right, who's watching a particular thing. I think that there's some really great value to that.
Yeah.
Knowing that the information that we put is all, it's on our website, it's in print, it's everywhere else. You can sort of get that other places, but that sort of spark of like, let me find my people, like might only happen in that one particular info session and things like that. So I think that's a really good insight. And I think I would also sort of say, very quickly to kind of round it out, like one of the things that I always think about very in the back of my mind as we're pushing a lot of these pivots toward digital is I think there's a lot of folks who are out there who don't necessarily have regular access to internet at home, or their internet access is on their mobile, and so they're not able to watch a broadband video, right? And kind of parse that. And so I'm always sort of thinking about, for those students, what is it like to learn more about schools, especially in this age where they can't visit in person. So like that's one more kind of barrier for them, like and in the past I've sort of suggested students kind of talk to reference librarians, or sort of, not that the librarians are experts on college or will have answers, but they can sort of say, okay, here's a person who might be able to sort of help me organize this research project, right? Who has a basic understanding of how to accumulate information, how to look through it, how to keep notes and track of what all the differences and similarities between colleges are.
Right.
And you can sort of get a sense of it that way. But, when we're thinking about kind of students who might not be able to watch hours of video, like, are there sort of suggestions that you might have? And it could be looking at brochures or getting on mailing lists or, email newsletters or things like that. Are there particular strategies that you think about that would be helpful for students who might not have as much access to the internet?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's hard too, because again, as to your point, so many institutions have made this shift to online programming. That doesn't mean it's actually accessible to everyone. One thing I would say is that I think that mailing lists can feel overwhelming too, because especially if a student is starting out with a pretty broad list of institutions, you are signing up to get a lot of information. But I do think, especially right now, it's valuable. I think, and you said something earlier that I think is important here too, seeing how institutions are talking about themselves in email, in print, et cetera, especially right now, is telling, right? Is this institution kind of using this opportunity to innovate? Is this institution using this opportunity to band its community together? Is this institution doing something that helped the community it's in and that surrounds it right now? I think you can get that kind of information. Some students I know find that making a college-specific email address is helpful, because then you have one place all that information is going instead of it necessarily clogging up a different inbox. And then I also think, and this generation always laughs, there's always somebody who laughs at it, but call admissions offices. We have phones staffed, and that is a really good opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody over the phone and get your questions answered in a way that I think a lot of people in this generation forget exists. And it's sometimes the fastest way to get information, right? Especially if it's a matter of you've taken that kind of cursory look at a website, or you've gotten that brochure in the mail and you've read through it and you have follow-up questions, right? Sometimes calling and talking to an admissions staff member is the best way to get those questions answered, because they might exist online, but you might have to click through 17 different things to find them. And that's somebody who's an expert. And so I think that if you have phone access, if you have the ability to call, I know that they're not used to it, but I think it can be really helpful. And there's a reason why we're always staffed on the phones. And I do think that, again, just like everything about this, it's going to be different for each individual student, because there are some students who may be watching this who are saying, I don't really have that many questions. Like, it all seems pretty straightforward to me. I've looked at schools I like, and that's great. And so if that means that you get those brochures in the mail and you read them and you're like, cool, I'm going to apply here, that's great. And it's awesome if you feel that, that amount of information is enough for you. But for some students, that might not be the case. And there are so many sources that don't involve sitting down and watching a 30-minute video, or sitting down and watching 10 30-minute videos from 10 different schools. And I think that while not everybody is putting out the same amount of print publication as they maybe have been in the past, I do think that even just getting yourself on a mailing list, so that if they send out one brochure, or if they send those email newsletters, like you said, you'll get them and you'll have easy access to them.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that you made about sort of the language that a school is using, or the kinds of communication they're putting out, is a really valid one, because I think a lot of times students are looking to see how schools are responding to some of these larger issues. Yep. We've been in this kind of tumultuous time since the spring in many ways, and I think that a lot of students are trying to understand, not just from the community perspective, but sort of from an administrative perspective,
right,
what is a school's response to a particular issue, or non-response in some cases, and what does that say about the school? And I think, as much as we love student voices and student, social media and all that sort of stuff, there is a way in which, as dry as it may be sometimes, hearing a message from our president and sort of saying how he responds to something, that gives you some really interesting insight to a school, right? And sort of what their thoughts are about who they are in this moment, and sort of what their vision is for their students, and how they sort of relate to the community at large. So I think there's a little bit more, less fun, I guess I should say, work sometimes that goes into that, but it can be equally important.
Absolutely. I think that now, the times we're living in, the pandemic, everything that's happening that has impacted college campuses so directly, I think has given a really important opportunity for campus leadership to really show where they stand. And I think that the ways in which different institutions have responded to students, have responded to staff like us, I think that it does say a lot. And I think that it what happens and how an institution approaches a time of crisis and a time of, I mean, the word unprecedented is like the most overused word of 2020, but it's true, right? I think it does say a lot. And I think that even if an individual student assumes that it might not impact them once they get to campus in the same way, you want to be on a campus where you feel like you'll be taken care of, and you'll feel like you are in the hands of people who get it and who care. And I think that this time is a time to read those statements from university leadership and to pay attention to that in a way that 17-year-olds might not normally. I do think you can get a lot from it, even if it isn't as exciting as like a panel of current sophomores.
Well, and I think to bring it back around, so a full circle, right? It goes back to this idea, to me anyway, of students identifying what their values are, what they're interested in, and sort of saying, how does a school map onto that, right? If something is particularly important to me, what is a school's reaction to something?
Right.
How do they support those students? What is the room that they have for discussion on campus about a particular thing? And there's no particular issue at play. I mean, it could be anything, right? We've had some students who I think have been some very intrepid, and I love them, who are asking me about dietary restrictions on campus, and just sort of like, how easy is it for me to like find particular types of food? Like, is the school open to that sort of thing? And that's what they care, like, obviously for very good reasons. That was what's important to them. I'm like, great, you should be asking those kinds of questions, right? And I think it's that sort of spirit that we want to encourage with students, is to say, like, know what you want out of your college experience, and then challenge us as schools to sort of answer those questions for you. And our job in many ways as admission officers is to sort of point you in the right direction, look for the right student voices that will help answer those questions for you as well, and round that out. But I think that, to me, that's like sort of where it comes back, right, to that idea. But it starts with the student really being solid on what they want out of a school and what their values are. Yeah,
and I think that that's, again, full circle, that's the perfect place to start. Even if you have specific schools in mind, even if there are names that are kind of circulating, sitting down and giving yourself that opportunity to reflect on, what do I want the next 4 years or that 4 years of my life to look like? What kinds of people do I want to surround myself with? What do I want to come out of this experience having gained or learned? And obviously part of it's a degree, which is the easiest thing to say. But when I think back to my college experience, I think that one of the most important decisions I made in choosing where I ended up attending was that I knew that I was going to a place where I wasn't going to have to sacrifice the things that mattered to me. And the things that matter to someone will vary, obviously, but I think that if you start this process thinking about what matters to you and thinking about your values and thinking about what you want college to be, it's going to make it a lot easier once you start picking through all the information we've been talking about and watching the content and hearing the voices. You'll get it. And you might get it for a lot of different places, and there might seem to be no common traits between them. And it's okay if you end up applying to schools that are drastically different from each other, because if they still kind of check those boxes for you of what you want, that means they're good fits for you. It's okay if your fit isn't dictated by the size or the location or the type of campus. For some students, it will be. For some students, they will only apply to schools that have under a certain number of students or over a certain number of students. And if that's a factor, that's great, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that that's one of the things that I always try to help students understand, is that your college search and your college experience is uniquely yours. And what matters to you is what matters in this process, really. And I think that as a starting point, and then using that kind of list of important pieces and important factors to then guide these other elements of research that we've been talking about can be really helpful. Yeah,
well, I think that's the kind of takeaway message, right? Is if you have a sense of why you're doing what you're doing as you're wading through these waters, it's often helpful because it gives you something to go back to, right? And you're like, this is what I'm looking for. And sort of like the messages that you're picking up on sort of tie back to this larger overarching theme.
Right.
And I think the thing that I would also add to that is to say, in my experience working with students, there's something to be said for acknowledging that your priorities, that your values might change.
Absolutely. Yep. And they probably will.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of times students are like, well, like I'm looking for this particular thing, and they just like set it, and then they're like off, and that's great. There's certainly some students who are just like very focused, and they know,
and then they stay on that path. Totally.
And it works out for them. But I think particularly what we've seen this past spring is once the pandemic hit, a lot of priorities have shifted for students, and kind of acknowledging that is something that might happen. I think it's scary sometimes for students to say, like, I have to sort of start over because the research that I've done might not speak to the things that I care about now. But
and I think that's huge. I mean, you think of, again, like thinking back to my own college search experience, when I think about being 16 and having a list of schools in my mind and schools that in my head were perfect fits for me. And then by the time I got around to applying, they weren't even on my list anymore. And I think that that's another thing too, right? I think that especially for those kids who might feel as though there is this specific path, and whether it's a specific school or just a specific type of school, it's okay for that to change. Like, the only one holding you to that is yourself. And I think it's so important to remember that being a teenager is a time of immense growth too. And you're going to grow a ton in college and things are going to change a lot in college, but it's okay if you start senior year with a certain idea and end senior year with a different one. And it like, give yourself that grace and that time to grow and recognize that no one other than yourself is holding you to what you thought a year ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. We've covered kind of a lot of ground. Are there any last thoughts that you have in terms of advice that you would give to students, or things that you think would be helpful for folks as they're thinking about how to learn more about schools, in this kind of age where they're not able to visit them?
Yeah, and I think we've said it a lot, but I think the most important thing to drive home is understanding your sources. And I think that I said this earlier, but a lot of students will find that everyone in their life becomes an expert on the college admissions process as soon as they're starting to go through it, right? And admissions in general, as we know and as everyone knows, is a very difficult thing to understand. And the process feels so scary to a lot of people. And I think some of that comes from the fact that you might hear from your mom's friend's aunt that they know somebody who had a better GPA than you and didn't get into this school. And they leave it at that, and they have very specific messages about what that means. And I think that while as we've been talking about, getting lots of perspectives and lots of voices can be really important, I think about who you would actually consider an expert on an individual school, not even the admissions process, but on an individual school. Would you consider somebody who knew someone who went there the expert, or the person who actually went there the expert, right? And I think that, as you said, places like College Confidential and other sort of kind of community forums, I guess you could say, like the Reddit threads about applying to college, it's not that you can't find great information there, it's that you need to make sure you're always taking everything that's not a direct source as a grain of salt, with a grain of salt. And I think that I would never want a student to take a school off their list because they saw one thing that scared them from somebody who might not even have experienced it themselves. So I think that especially now with all this digital programming and online sources, and that really being the way that students, at least right now, are finding schools, everything should be with a grain of salt unless it's coming from the direct source. That's like my main advice.
And that's a good one. I think this idea of kind of evaluating your sources, right? And basic media literacy is well,
Totally.
Especially like in this age where there's just so much information for students to parse through. It's just challenging, I think, on base level. So sort of that idea of putting things in context and who is an expert in what, right? So,
exactly.
A student who went to Northwestern, for example, would be great about the student experience. They might not have the best information about when our application is due. Right. And that's sort of our job, right? So we have different experts for different things. And I think having students sort of know that there's not always going to be one voice who knows everything about everything.
Yep.
So
I think that's huge.
Yeah. And I think that's really good advice overall, because I think sometimes students lean in one direction. They're like, oh, this is the official source, so everything they say is true. I'm like, well, yeah, what are we experts in? I think that's the question you want to ask. Right. So I think that's a good takeaway message.
Yes.
But that's pretty much everything that I think we want to cover in terms of kind of basic advice. I really want to say thanks for taking the time and chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you.
It was great to have this experience, and we got to show off a little bit of the Siegel Visitor Center. So when we're back in business, students can come by and visit and sort of say hello to us. But with that, I would say, it was a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time. Hopefully this is good information that we got out to students.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris.
All right.
This has been great.
Have a good one.
Cool.